Thank you very much. Thank you for bringing me to South Africa. It's very exciting to be here. This is as far south as I've been on the continent, and it's awfully exciting. I was in Shetland about 3 days ago, so I've come from about as far north as you can go in the UK to as far south as you can go in Africa. And it's a bit of a whiplash, but at least there's no jet lag. So I want to start with a little parable that a friend of mine told me. Someone who used to work in the packaged goods industry, consumer packaged goods, these companies that make things like candy bars and nappies and soap and so on. They're very market-driven, they're not engineer-driven. They have big engineering departments, but they're told what to do by their marketing departments. They do research and figure out what people want. So one day, the marketing people have been off doing whatever kind of retreat marketing people do, Ayurvedic yoga or something, and they came back with a brain flash for the engineers. They said, look, we've been thinking about this, and we've decided that what people really want is they want laundry detergent that will make their clothes newer. So the engineering department, they tried unsuccessfully to convey the substance of Newton's second law of thermodynamics to the marketing department, and eventually they gave up. And they realized that the marketing department was speaking imprecisely, that what they meant when they said newer was not the technical definition of newer, not a localized state of reversed entropy, but rather newer looking, a kind of superficial appearance of newer. And by happy coincidence, they've been working with hot water triggered enzymes. And these hot water triggered enzymes attacked fiber ends. And a broken fiber has twice as many ends as an intact fiber, and broken fibers are what make clothes look old. And so they said, well, here we go. You put this in with a hot water wash, and it will dissolve the broken fiber ends, and the clothes will come out looking newer. Now, looking is the important word here, because of course, if you're dissolving fibers in a garment, you are doing the opposite of making it newer. You are making it much older very quickly, and after not so many washes, it will dissolve entirely. But it satisfied the superficial requirement, and off they went. And you can buy hot water activated enzymatic detergents today that will make your clothes newer. And in most ways, that's a kind of harmless delusion, the delusion that your clothes get newer. But not every delusion where you have someone speaking in non-technical terms and conveying their needs to technical people, not every delusion that we arrive at is as harmless. And that's what I want to talk about today, one of the more important and less harmless delusions about technology, and specifically about internet technology and general purpose computers. Now, yesterday and the day before, we talked a lot at this event about fully wiring South Africa, the notional goal now of getting internet connectivity and therefore internet connected terminals into all of South Africa by 2020. Whether or not you think that's going to happen by that date, it's pretty clear that that's the direction the world is going. And as a consequence, we are increasingly inhabiting a world that is made out of networked computers. Now, I flew down here in a Boeing 747 from London, and that Boeing 747 wasn't so much an airplane as it was a Sun Solaris workstation connected to a bunch of badly secured SCADA controllers in a very fancy aluminium case. It just happened to be a computer that I put my body into. Most modern buildings are computers that you live in. If you remove the computer from most modern buildings, they cease to be habitable almost immediately. If you leave the computers out of most modern buildings, they will rapidly become permanently uninhabitable. It's the trade-off we make for hermetically sealed new materials environments that are, or buildings that are very environmentally sound, but are also sealed against the elements and need to be dehumidified and watched and homeostatically controlled. Otherwise, they start to rot from the inside out. And it's not just that we have computers that we put our bodies into, although those are everywhere. I mean, your car is a computer that you stick your body into that then hurtles down the road at 60 miles an hour, surrounded by other people also trapped in their computers, hurtling down the road at 60 miles an hour. But we also increasingly insert computers into our bodies. So some of you are a little younger than me, most of you are about my age or a little older, and that means that we're either members of the iPod or the Walkman generation. So collectively, we've logged enough earbud hours that there will come a day, and not so very long, where we will need hearing aids. And it's vanishingly unlikely that those hearing aids are going to be hipster, retro, beige, plastic, transistorized analog hearing aids. It's far more likely that those hearing aids will be computers that we stick in our ears. And depending on whether or not those computers are doing their jobs, and depending on whose orders they take, They will either faithfully report to us what's going on, or they will be able to selectively withhold some of the things around us, or make us hear things that aren't there, or tell other people about what we're hearing. So, when you have a world that is made out of network computers, it follows that every problem that we have will involve a networked computer, in the same way that every problem that we have today involves someone wearing clothes or spending money or being in a car. They're not car or clothes or money problems, but they are problems in which cars and clothes and money are implicated. And now computers can be added to that list. And increasingly, because policymakers have a fairly cursory grasp of computer science and networking theory, increasingly policymakers are attempting to solve their problems by changing the computers, by changing the networks. And that's really the substance of the talk. And as it turns out, we've been running a kind of live experiment for 15 years in solving social problems with technology mandates. And what I'm talking about here is the copyright wars. And I think by examining the copyright wars, we can get a glimpse of what the future might look like and maybe start to prepare to make it a better one. Now, back in the 1980s, you may remember that software was sold in packages in shops, hanging from pegs in boxes or in Ziploc bags. And software vendors were interested in finding a way to stop people from copying their software. They wanted to make it harder so that they could increase their sales. And they tried all kinds of technological tricks that today we would call digital rights management, or DRM, to try and stop people from copying their works. They tried things like dongles, right? If you had a computer and you wanted to run AutoCAD, AutoCAD would give you a little thing that you plug into your printer port, and unless it was there, AutoCAD wouldn't run. It would check and do some kind of handshake with that hardware to see whether it was there, and otherwise it wouldn't run. Or they would ask you to turn to a certain page in the manual and turn to a certain paragraph in that page and then enter a word from that paragraph in order to unlock. Or they would have some kind of physical defect in the floppy disk that they would check for at runtime, and if that physical defect couldn't be detected, it would refuse to run. Now, if you cast your mind back to those days, one thing that you'll recall is that none of this stuff actually worked. Right? None of this stuff worked worth a hill of beans, because conceptually, what it was trying to do was stop skilled attackers from discovering secrets hidden in technology that they were able to take home, right? And so this is like giving the bank robber the safe to keep in his sitting room. And it doesn't really matter how good the safe is. There's not really any chance that the safe will stay intact when you do this. But actually, it was worse than that, because conceptually, here's what you're trying to do when you do DRM. You're saying, okay, I have a ciphertext. I have some encrypted, scrambled stuff, a program, a music file, a game file, an ebook. And I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to give you an app to decode that file so that you can run it, so that you can render it in the clear. And whenever that program runs, it's going to check to see whether or not you are entitled to decrypt the file. And if it sees that you're not entitled, it's going to shut itself off. Once it determines that you are entitled to decrypt the file, it'll decrypt the file, but it won't let you save the file in the clear. It will erase the clear text when it exits. And this has a kind of cargo cult-like resemblance to a security system, but when you start to actually do security analysis on it, you can see that it doesn't really hold together. If we're doing real crypto, if you actually were serious about keeping a secret, you have this theoretical model where you have a kind of two people who trust each other and an attacker in the middle. And cryptographers talk about Alice and Bob trying to send a message to each other, and Carol is trying to intercept the message between Alice and Bob. So the idea is that Bob sends Alice the ciphertext, and Alice has the keys to decrypt the ciphertext, and she decrypts the ciphertext and can do whatever she wants with it, and Carol doesn't have the keys. So even though she can intercept the ciphertext, she can get the scrambled message as it goes from Alice to Bob, without the keys, it's no good to her. But in voodoo crypto, in voodoo DRM, what you do is you say, okay, there's just Bob and Alice, and Bob is going to give Alice the ciphertext and the program to decipher it and the keys, but he's going to ensure somehow that Alice doesn't misuse the keys, that she only uses them in the way Bob wants her to, and that she throws them away when she's done and asks them again for a new set the next time she wants to decrypt the message. Now, there's a technical term for this in cryptography. It's called wishful thinking. Because in reality, it's not just Bob and Alice, right? There's one Bob, and everybody in the world is Alice. And the most skilled Alice among us, the person who has the best chance of breaking the crypto and rendering a clear text, that Alice, if she can break it, gets to distribute her break to everybody else. So it's Bob versus the world. So Alice can do lots of things. She can, for example, hack a Save As button into the app so that once the file has been decrypted, you can save the file. She can extract the keys. She can share the decrypted files. She can write instructions so that other people can extract the keys. It doesn't matter which one of these things she does, it all comes down to the same thing. So from the beginning, this idea of locking up a computer so that the person sitting at the console can't do something that you don't want them to do has been a fool's errand. It's a kind of break once, break everywhere exercise in futility that did nothing to prevent copying, which meant that it was always easier to get DRM unlocked versions of files than it was to get DRM locked versions. From kind of evolutionary perspective, the legitimate copies that the vendor wanted you to get were neutered before they were distributed. They couldn't reproduce themselves. Whereas the pirate copies were fecund. They could be reproduced infinitely. And very quickly, the ecosystem filled up with the thing that could copy itself without restriction, and the legitimate copies dwindled away to a tiny rump off to one edge. So it kind of failed as a business strategy as well. Now, when we get into these discussions about copyright and technology, we tend to get distracted in long and, to my mind, pointless arguments about whether or not digital rights management can create sales or whether it costs you sales, whether it's fair, whether it prohibits doing things that are legal or should be legal, whether it works as a technical matter. But I think these are the wrong sorts of questions to be asking. I mean, not if you're me, right? Not if your business is being in the entertainment industry and making things that other people want to get. In that case, it's very important. But let's face it, there's a vanishingly small number of people who make their living from the entertainment industry, and there's a lot more people who are impacted by DRM. For the wider society, digital rights management is, and the legitimacy of it is independent of questions of what it does to artists' income. That is, even if breaking other people's computers was good for sales and totally fair and great for the entertainment industry and wholly effective, I still think that there are good reasons to oppose it on grounds that are much more important than any of those things. For the record, I don't think that's true. For the record, as you'll have seen with my own works, I think that we can do well without having to break other people's computers. But I want to stress that even if you disagree with that, I still think you should be suspect of DRM. And to understand why, I think we have to unpack some of our nerd complacency and realize that it's impossible to talk about technology without examining and weighing the legal code at the same time as we look at the software code. So that's what this talk is about. The harm from using technology and technology mandates to solve social problems. And I think the copyright wars were just the first salvo in something that is about to happen for a century or more. So let's look at what they can teach us. And to do that, I have to bring in a UN agency called WIPO, not WAPO. I was very confused for the first couple of days when people kept saying WAPO, and to my North American ear, I kept hearing WIPO. WIPO is the World Intellectual Property Organization. It's a specialized UN agency that makes the world's copyright treaties. It has the same relationship to bad copyright law that Mordor has to evil. It's kind of the root node of dumb copyright ideas. Now, in 1996, WIPO passed two treaties, the internet treaties. One's called the WIPO Copyright Treaty, or WCT, and one's called the WIPO Performers and Phonograms Treaty, the WPPT. And they're likely the most important treaties you've never heard of. And what these did was they created a burden on member states to pass laws to protect DRM. Member states had to pass laws that made it illegal to break DRM, that made it illegal to extract the keys from DRM, that made it illegal to tell people how to extract the keys from DRM, that made it illegal to host keys or instructions for extracting keys or breaking DRM, and to make it illegal to automate key extraction with programs. And then they also passed a set of rules that required any intermediary, anyone hosting content that other people authored, such that they would have to censor that content if someone emailed them an accusation of that content being infringing or being something that might abet copyright infringement, might abet breaking DRM. So it effectively created this extrajudicial means for censoring content from the internet. You just had to point at it and say, that's a key, and the hosts would have to remove the material. Now, this spread around the world through the efforts primarily of the US Trade Representative. In Canada, we just passed a bill called C11. I'm from Canada originally, I live in the UK now. We passed a bill called C11 that brought us into compliance with these treaties and repeated the American law that established the treaties in America, the DMCA of 1998. You'll have heard, I'm sure, people on the internet writing about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA. Canada just came into compliance with it in 2012. In Korea, they passed the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement. Australia has the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. And then all around the world, countries are signing up to implement this treaty because it's a condition of getting into free trade agreements like ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and things like the Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, which is a European-US free trade agreement. Countries that don't come into compliance often find themselves on the US Trade Representative's special watch list. And this is a watch list that's used to kind of internationally shame and intimidate governments that haven't passed these laws. And many developing and least developed nations have passed comparable laws after being put on the USTR's special watch list. Now, where has all of this action since 1996 gotten us? Well, they've made it illegal to reverse engineer technology that has DRM in order to add interoperability to it. So if there is DRM on something, in order to interface with that technology, you have to reverse engineer it. And because reverse engineering it involves extracting the keys, that's against the law. That's a pretty sweet setup if you're running a company. You add a layer of DRM to your technology, and no one is allowed to add features to it without your permission. So how did that play out in the real world? Let's try a thought experiment. Imagine that it's 1996, the year that DVDs came out. And you walked into a Virgin Megastore in Piccadilly Circus and bought £1,000 worth of DVDs and £1,000 worth of CDs. Now, DVDs and CDs are pretty similar technologies. These days we read them with the same lasers, we manufacture them in the same plants, and they're effectively the same technology, just a slight format difference. But there's another important non-technological legal difference between DVDs and CDs, which is that DVDs are wrapped up with a very thin layer of DRM, not a very effective layer of DRM. It was broken by a Norwegian teenager in an afternoon, but a very thin layer of DRM. And what that DRM means is that it's against the law to make a DVD player without licensing the keys. It's not technically challenging to make a DVD player without licensing the keys. You probably all have VLC running on your computers. You have a DVD player that runs without licensing the key, but VLC is illegal in every country that has come into compliance with the WIPO Copyright Treaty, which is every country that is contemplating ACTA or NAFTA or TPP membership. And in theory, if your country is a member of the WTO, as South Africa is, and they don't implement this, they can be sued in a trade court and forced to implement this in their national law, because the WCT is part of the WTO agreement. So every country that trades on the global stage has to pass this law making it illegal. So how's that played out in the real world? How's it played out where it's not hard, but it's illegal for a firm to make a DVD player without permission from the entertainment industry? Well, to imagine that, take your £1,000 worth of notional DVDs and your £1,000 worth of notional CDs and put them in a safe, and then open the safe. It's 20 years later almost, 2013. So it's been 17 years since you put those CDs and those DVDs in the safe, and you open them up, and an amazing thing has happened to the CDs. Normally, if you take that technology and you put it on the shelf, it immediately starts losing value. And so after 13, 14 years, generally speaking, that stuff is just e-waste. You sort of have to wait 50 years before it's collectible again. But those CDs have done something incredible. When you bought those CDs in 1996, you could do one thing with them. You could play them. But because there's no DRM, there are an infinite number of legal things you can do with those CDs, thanks to technologies that have come out from mainstream companies like Microsoft and Apple, and that have been included in free open source operating systems like Ubuntu. You can rip them, you can stream them, you can back them up, you can mash them up, you can turn them into alarm tones and ringtones, you can put them in your school presentations. All of that and more is what you get from your CDs. That's the dividend that we've gotten because we have a free and open market in adding features, lawful features, to CDs. Now, what have we got for those DVDs that have been sitting in your vault since 1996? What new features have been added since the debut of the DVD in 1996? None. Not one new feature has been added as a lawful feature for the DVD. You can do exactly what you could do with that DVD in 1996. You can watch it, and that's all. It's not technically challenging to add the features, but the features have nevertheless not been added in the stream of commerce or in any legal software or technology. The dividend that you would have received from those DVDs having features added to them has been trousered by the studios that control the keys to DVDs. They have picked the world's pockets and trousered the difference. And now they sell us those features one feature at a time. So if you want to stream the movie that you bought on DVD, you have to pay for that again. If you want to back up the DVD that you bought, you have to pay for that again. If you want to take it to a new region and play it on a new player, you have to pay for that again. I call it the urinary tract infection business model. With the CD, all the value locked up in that CD flows in a healthy gush. With the DVD, all of the value locked up in it comes one painful drip at a time. So, you not only have a ban on implementing DVD features without permission, but even if you do have permission to implement DVD features, the DRM licensing rules, and these are universal across all DRMs, require anyone implementing a DRM system to implement it in such a way that users can't modify it. Why do they want it so that users can't modify? Well, that's kind of obvious, right? If you've got a DVD player that says, allow this movie to be played once, you don't want the user going in and changing the play once flag to play 50 million times, right? So when you ban user modifiability, you ban something very important. You ban all free and open source software. You ban Ubuntu, you ban all Linux implementations, because of course these can only be implemented in a way that users can modify. That is what it is to be free and open source software. So free and open source software has made an enormous difference in networking technologies. I dare say your data centers are stuffed with free and open source software, and there's a reason that they're stuffed with it, because it's the best of breed, because the difference between proprietary software and free software is the difference between alchemy and science. You know, before science came along, everybody who wanted to do something technical kept what they learned a secret. They did whatever they could. They used the best techniques that they could come up with, but they never told anyone else what they learned. And as a result, every alchemist discovered for himself that drinking mercury was a bad idea. The major difference between alchemy and science is publication and scrutiny and peer review, and that's what we get from free and open source software, and that's why it's suicide to run IIS in your data center. So, thank you. Sorry, I lost my place here. So, why does interoperability matter? It doesn't just matter because there are features that the company wants to keep to itself that you might want to implement, where the company wants to hoard the value and you want to extract the value. Sometimes the company doesn't want to implement the feature just because they don't think the feature is worth implementing. In general, where we see really top-notch accessibility technology, technology that helps people who are visually impaired, technology that helps people with physical impairments use everyday operating systems, those are implemented by people working in the nonprofit sector, working with organizations that advocate for disabled people, or by disabled people themselves, because they have a sense of exactly what they need that is not correctly transmitted to the vendors, the major vendors who want to do this. So free and open source software tends to have excellent accessibility features far ahead of proprietary technology. And, you know, the big proprietary software vendors, the reason they're eschewing accessibility isn't because they don't like disabled people, it's just because disabled people aren't a commercially compelling market for them to add features. And it's not just disabled people. One of the things that we've learned from the Ubuntu experiment is that the developing world has an enormous amount of local technology needs, and there was an excellent presentation yesterday morning from the gentleman from Ushahidi about the special needs of people in the developing world for their technology. And where you don't have these mandates that prohibit interoperability, people from the developing world are able to make made-in-Africa Africa technology to solve Made in Africa problems without having to hope that some overseas corporation will see fit to adopt the features that they need in their special context. Not only that, but one thing that we've learned from Ubuntu is that it's not a one-way transfer. That when you let people in the developing world add features to their technology, that people in the developed world benefit too, because there are things that we all have to learn from each other. DRM mandates that prohibit user modifiability necessarily prohibit that kind of two-way transfer. So interoperability, though, is just the first casualty of digital rights management. And I've saved the gravest consequence, the one that I really want you to be thinking about for last, and that's transparency. To understand the relationship of transparency to DRM, we have to think about what DRM does. If I have a DRM on my device, say I've got an iOS device from Apple, and I want to run some software that Apple hasn't blessed, that hasn't come from the App Store on my device, Apple wants to stop me from doing that. Now, their technology platform is capable of running all the code we can compile, so it's not that their computer doesn't run that code. It's that it has a process lurking in the background that watches to see whether you're attempting to run code that hasn't been signed by Apple. And if it discovers you doing something that's on the prohibited list, that program swims to the fore and says, instead of, yes, master, it says, I can't let you do that, Dave. Now, an I can't let you do that, Dave program is rather fraught. If you had an icon on your desktop labeled, I can't let you do that, Dave.exe, you would drag that icon into the trash, right? Nobody wants that program on their computer. Nobody woke up this morning and said, you know what I want? A tablet that doesn't run programs from vendors I choose, right? So the only way to make the I can't let you do that, Dave program run is to design the operating system so that it misreports the contents of the file system and misreports the stack of running programs. And the process manager has to be compromised too, so that you can't just go in there and, kill -9 with fire. I can't let you do that, Dave.exe. That creates an enormous danger, because as soon as you design computers to lie to their owners, if somebody wants to do something naughty with that computer that attacks the owner's interests, and they can figure out how to hijack the invisibility cloak that you've built into the operating system, they will be invisible to the user and to things like virus checkers that run on the user's behalf to stop bad software from running. And there's a real-world example of this that's very instructive. In 2005, one of the big labels, Sony BMG, shipped 51 audio CDs, 6 million copies of these, with something called a rootkit on them. The way that this worked is when you stuck the CD in your Windows machine, it had a little auto-run script that would launch and silently run and change the kernel of your Windows machine. So that if there was a file on your hard drive that was prepended with, that started with $SYS, and you listed out the directory wouldn't see that file. And if that file could be run as a process, and the process began with $SYS, and you checked the process monitor to see whether or not that program was running, the process manager wouldn't see it either. It would lie to you. It would say there is no program called $SYS, foo.exe running on this computer. The reason Sony did this is they wanted to run a process that checked to see whether you were ripping a CD. And if you were, it would just kill that process, that you couldn't rip the CD. What they effectively did, though, was they punched an enormous hole in your computer's operating system. And as we know, when your immune system is compromised, you get parasitic, opportunistic infections. And that's exactly what happened with the Sony rootkit. As soon as the knowledge of the Sony rootkit became widespread, virus writers started prepending their viruses with $SYS, because they knew if they did this, not only could the user not see them, but neither could the antivirus software. It was impossible to root out without reinstalling the operating system. Now that's bad enough. But Dan Kaminsky, a security researcher, did some very clever work on DNS, because these made specialized DNS queries to hosts that nobody else was looking for. And so by looking at DNS traffic, you could see where this software was resident and how many hosts it was resident. Dan estimates that there were 300,000 infections on US government and military networks from the Sony rootkit. So that's the true cost of DRM. that in order for DRM to work, you have to put a moat in the eye of the computer. You have to have a mandate for weak security and opacity. Consider what we've seen when other people have tried to solve their own problems by selectively breaking computers. In the United States, the spy agency, the National Security Agency, that's been in the news rather a lot, was just outed for subverting security technology. They were building backdoors secretly into commercial operating systems and software, as well as subverting the standardization process. So NIST's randomizer was subverted by the National Security Agency. NIST yesterday reopened comments on something like a 10-year-old standard, unheard of for NIST, because they acknowledged that the randomizer was deliberately crippled. So why did the NSA do this? Well, they had a problem they wanted to solve. They wanted to be able to look inside other people's computers. And the only way to do that was to weaken the overall security of computers across the world. Effectively, as a means of solving their problem, their localized problem of who's doing something that we might want to interdict, they compromised the security of all computers. They've compromised the banking system, the healthcare system, the transit system, the air traffic control system, your data and mine. They are the next phase of the DRM wars. Your network infrastructure has been deliberately flawed, and anyone smart enough can exploit these flaws, and it leaves our networked world vulnerable to crooks and hackers and spies and creeps of every description. So that matters for reasons that are, to my mind, much more significant than any of the stakes in the war on terror. Now, when people talk about this stuff, they're often accused of being out there because information wants to be free. So a couple of weeks ago, Information and I went on a retreat. We rented a cabin in the Cotswolds, and we made fires, and we drank mulled wine, and we cried a little. And then Information put its arm around my shoulders and whispered into my ear and confessed to me that it doesn't want a single damn thing in the whole world except for us to stop anthropomorphizing it. Because information doesn't want anything. Information is an abstraction. But people want to be free. And people can't be free if they can't trust their computers. People can't be free if they can't modify their software so that it does what they want to do rather than what someone else wants them to do. In a networked society, in a world where everybody does everything through their computers and through their network connections, you can't be free unless your computer is free. Not free as in beer, but free as in speech. In the United Kingdom, where I live, we have probably the coolest government job ever. There's a woman named Martha Lane Fox whose title is the Champion for Digital Inclusion. She's also the Baroness of Soho, which is pretty cool, but Champion for Digital Inclusion is even cooler. And when she got the job, she decided she would measure what happened when people got internet access. What happens when the most vulnerable people in the United Kingdom were given access to the internet? Did it just become a means for arguing with people, or playing solitaire, or was it something that was really, really useful to them? Now, she had a ready-made experimental theater for discovering or investigating this question, because in the north of England, where there had been widespread industrial collapse, very high levels of poverty, and large numbers of people living in state-subsidized housing, there had been a pilot program to bring internet access to a housing block for a couple of years at that point. And so here she had two populations, the people who lived in that housing block, who'd had internet access for a couple of years, through no choice of their own. They were just, closer to the CO, so the DSL was easier to wire up. And the people in the next housing block over, who didn't have internet access. So two very comparable populations with one significant difference. She hired PricewaterhouseCoopers to go in and study the lives of the people who had internet access. And what she discovered was that the people living in the housing estate with internet access had their lives improved on every axis that we use to measure the success of a government social program, on every axis that we use to measure quality of life. Their kids not only have better educations, as you might expect, and better access to tertiary education and therefore more social mobility, but the parents have better jobs. Of course they have better jobs. If there's two ways of doing a job search, one is walking the streets looking for help wanted signs, and the other is logging into the internet and finding all the employers in your area, you will have a better job. So that meant they had more disposable income and better nutrition. They were more civically engaged, more likely to volunteer and work in their community, and more politically engaged, more likely to vote, better aware of what the issues were in their community. So the internet becomes a single wire that not only delivers what we knew about already, free speech, free assembly, and a free press, but also access to education, social mobility, to a decent income and a decent job, better nutrition, better healthcare outcomes, civic and political engagement. So that's why information, the freedom of information matters. Not because of information itself, but because all of us are dependent on information technology for our freedom. Computers on our desks and in our pockets, the computers we insert our bodies into and into which we insert our bodies, have the power to liberate us or to enslave us. When computers do when computers don't tell us what they're doing, they expose us to terrible, terrible risks. In 2012, the Federal Trade Commission, the US body that does consumer watchdog actions on behalf of the government, entered into a settlement with 8 companies. One was a software company that made anti-theft software for laptops, and the other 7 were in the hire purchase business, the rent-to-own business. So you could go to them and pay a little every month to buy something that you couldn't afford to buy outright. Primarily what they were in the rent-to-own business for was laptops, because of course you can't fully participate in society without a laptop, and so even people who can't afford to buy one still need to find a way to get one. Now the company that made the software had sold it out to these 7 companies so that they could recover laptops if they were stolen, or so that they could recover laptops if payments ceased to be made. And what the software did was allowed for the covert remote operation of the microphone, the camera, to keylog, to capture the screen, and to look at all the files on the hard drive over the network. And when these 8 companies settled with the Federal Trade Commission, they stipulated, they admitted, that they had routinely used this software to video record their customers, including video recordings of them having sex, video recordings of their children in the nude, audio recordings of them having confidential conversations. They had intercepted their credentials for their banking, legal, and medical websites, as well as their banking, legal, and medical records. And they had also just passed the login credentials around the office so that they could look at their hard drives for interesting files to share. And the Federal Trade Commission, as you'd hope with a consumer watchdog agency, they said to these 8 companies, no more of this. You may not do this again unless you put it in the terms and conditions. Unless somewhere in that long hairball of legalese that we click through 100 times a day without reading it, because we know, without having to read it, that what it says is, by being dumb enough to use this service, you agree that we're allowed to come over to your house and punch your grandmother and wear your underwear and make long-distance calls and eat all the food in your fridge. That if you inserted, you also agree that we're allowed to video record you in the nude having sex, you could go on doing it. When we don't realize that computers have the power to harm us, that computers are at the center of so much that we do, we make bad policy about them. And that's a kind of standout example. And they're not the only example. All over the world, dictatorships are eagerly snapping up commercial software from companies like VuPen and Finfisher, companies from the developed world, the US, Canada, France, Italy, software that is called lawful interception software, but what is really malicious software, malware, that's deployed by government agencies, by the police, against people that they want to spy on, and used to hijack the cameras, the microphones, and other components of their computers, including their phones, their laptops, and their tablets. This is not only bad because it enables dictatorships to figure out who to arrest and who to torture and who to murder, it's also bad because it's created a thriving market in zero-day exploits. So rather than what we had before, which is that if you were a security researcher and you discovered a flaw in an operating system, a flaw that left all of us vulnerable, the thing that you would do is report it to the vendor, and then maybe if they didn't patch it, you would go public with it. Instead now, the smart thing to do is to sell it to a company that sells to governments for millions. And as a result, we are all made that much less secure. Computers in our bodies may sound like science fiction. When I talk about this stuff, you may think, well, there's a science fiction writer on the stage talking about something that will happen in the future. But again, in 2012, a researcher who's just passed away, a guy named Barnaby Jack, gave an amazing presentation at a security conference in Australia. Now, Barnaby Jack's speciality was implanted devices, specifically implanted defibrillators. These are wonderful technology. If you have a heart problem, if your heart loses the rhythm and puts you in danger of dying, your doctor can anesthetize you, she can make an incision in your chest, spread your ribs, reach into your chest, and attach a computer with a battery directly to your heart. And the computer listens to your heart beating. And when your heart loses the rhythm, the battery gives it a shock and brings your heart back into rhythm. And it keeps us alive. People you know probably have this in their bodies right now. Now, implanted defibrillators, doctors want to get telemetry off of them. They want to know what they're doing. They want to update their operating systems. And it's kind of difficult to attach a cable to a computer that's lodged in your chest cavity. And so they have a wireless interface, just like everything else, right? Basically, the whole world's a big microwave oven these days. And that's where Barnaby Jack comes in, because from 10 meters away, Barnaby Jack could sense the wireless beacon from your implanted defibrillator. He could hijack the operating system, rewrite the firmware, and cause the defibrillator to seek out other defibrillators to hijack and rewrite the firmware on, so it was a worm. But its payload was that it could deliver lethal shocks. Now, embedded systems are one of the hot areas for trading in malicious software, right? Governments want to get lots and lots of zero-day vulnerabilities for implanted systems so they can play out their Tom Clancy fantasies through programs like Stuxnet, that was the attack on the Iranian nuclear program. And so as a result, those of us who depend on implanted systems, and that's more and more of us, and it'll be you and me someday if we live long enough, we are all made vulnerable to these 0 days not being patched because governments are interested in keeping them a secret. The bad news is that policymakers are not going to stop making this mistake. They're going to keep on making this mistake because everything we do has a computer in it, and every problem involves a computer, and every problem will have the same solution. Make me a computer that does everything but doesn't run the program that upsets me. We can see this with every new NSA link. Network computers are an attractive nuisance to authoritarian states. Everyone with a problem tries to solve their problem by breaking networks and the computers that they terminate. Now that runs up against an enormous theoretical problem, the problem of Turing completeness. So those of you who are up on your computer science history will know that Alan Turing was a great hero of computer science. He was the cryptographer that worked with Polish and British cryptographers at Bletchley Park in the United Kingdom to crack the Nazi and Japanese ciphers. Churchill credited him with ending the war 2 years early. And Turing, that was just his first act. For his second act, he created the general purpose computing architecture, a theoretical model that we call Turing completeness, whereby he showed that a computer that was capable of running all programs that could be expressed in symbolic logic was equivalent to all other computers. It may run slower or faster, but all computers that were Turing complete could run all programs. We don't have a model for a computer that can run every program except for the one that you don't like. Our only model for Turing complete minus one, our closest approximation, is a computer that can run every program, but that has spyware on it out of the box, that has the I can't let you do that Dave program out of the box, and the operating system facility for hiding that program from the user so that she can't root it out as every smart user would want to do. As the masters of the technological universe, we are contemptuous of DRM. We know that we can defeat it with the wave of a debugger, but that doesn't make it harmless. Our own complacency about digital rights management, about the idea that we can solve problems by hijacking other people's computers for their own good, is the most dangerous thing about it. Our coming century holds 1,000 more fights about this. The fights over yes, master versus I can't let you do that, Dave. It's up to us. We are building the future with every network drop, with every device we distribute, with every operating system we install, with every person we teach. We build the future. And if we allow spyware and rootkits to be built into our computers, if we put moats in their eyes, then we will make a future that makes computers into a lever to turn every petty tyrant into a global dictator. Or we can resist. We can refuse to wave our hands at the silly marketing department when they demand that we do something that the theory tells us is impossible. We can refuse to give in to the deluded politician, to the holly weird fat cats who say that unless HTML5 gets DRM support, they're going to take their movies back to AOL. They tell us it's a war between extremism and freedom. But Edward Stone has shown us that the extremism that threatens us today is the vile and unforgivable idea that technology is best used to shackle us and not to set us free. Whether you're using a network to plan a terrorist attack or to spy on everyone in the world in the name of preventing terrorist attacks, You are an extremist, and you are on the wrong side of history. So I'm an artist. That's how I make my living. My livelihood depends on the sale of entertainment product, on my ability to compel some fraction of the people out there to pay me money to help them while away the hours between the cradle and the grave with my silly made-up fairy tales. And I think DRM is rubbish and of no help to me for reasons I've gone into at considerable length in this talk. But even if I were convinced that DRM was the only way to earn a living from my little made-up stories, I would still say that we shouldn't have it. I would get a real job. Because as much as I want to take my family to Disneyland on holiday and buy my daughter nice clothes and pay off the mortgage, I want to make a free and fair world for my daughter even more. And I think you should too. There is no way to fight oppression without devices and networks that honor their users. So it's up to us to build the freedom layer into our devices and networks to enable that struggle. Now, there's an amazing thing about the theory of computers and cryptography. It turns out that the universe wants us to have secrets. It turns out that it is so much easier to scramble a message than it is to descramble it by brute force, that properly implemented crypto allows us to have the freedom layer if only we resist the sabotage efforts, if only we resist commercial imperatives that say proprietary software will be used in this context because we can make this software a little bit pregnant, a little bit alchemical, a little bit secret so that its security can't be audited by third parties. Just trust us. The universe wants us to have secrets, and we can have secrets. We can take the universe up on its offer if we are willing to use strong crypto well implemented. We can be cyber optimists, cautious cyber optimists. We can secure the network and use it to coordinate the struggle for freedom, to seize the means of information and use it to liberate every person on the planet. Thank you. So is that 10 minutes for questions, or are we out of time? I know we started a little late, so. Yeah, 10 minutes for questions? Yeah, go ahead. If you speak briefly and loudly, I will amplify it for the rest of the audience.
Thanks very much, Cory. That was fantastic. Do you think there is, though, a market requirement in the general market for the I can't do that, Dave type applications? I mean, if I just think about a general end user, if I think of my mother using a PC, she wants that application on her PC because she's so scared about what she might do by mistake or unknowingly to break her device. And to be honest, I won't use an Apple device for all the reasons you spoke about. The people that do give you that exact answer. It just works.
Okay, so the question is there a general requirement for this? Are naive users, and I don't like the example of mums. I mean, I think there are lots of mums out there who are very technologically savvy. But your mom, my mom's not. Even my gran, who wasn't very technologically savvy, I think it wasn't because there's anything inherently hard about technology. It's just because by the time she was 85, she had better things to do with her life than watch progress bars. But when my daughter was born and she worked out the only way to see her, apart from the 2 weeks that we're in Toronto, was to use Skype. She just figured out Skype. And that's one of the things that actually gives me hope, is that it's not inherently hard to learn this stuff, and as the applications expand, so too do the number of people for whom this stuff matters. But for people who are naive or not technologically skilled, isn't it good that we can design computers to stop users from doing things that might harm them? And I think that we need to distinguish between a computer that helps you not make mistakes and a computer that, when you choose to do something that the vendor didn't anticipate, takes active countermeasures to prevent you. So I don't run as a super user on my computer, right? Neither do you probably. It's bad cess to run as a super user on your computer. And your computer does lots of things to stop you from being an idiot when you're in super user mode. And your computer may have a boot block recovery system for when you inadvertently wipe the BIOS, as I've done more than once. And lots of other things. And we can conceptualize a system for preventing users from shooting themselves in the foot that doesn't put an invisibility cloak in their computer. We can put, instead of an "I can't let you do that, Dave" program into the computer, which we know in fact doesn't solve the problem, right? What happens when you have a thing, I was a CIO for a long time, so I had all these users that I was responsible for, and I would try to lock down their computers so that they wouldn't install bad stuff on their computers. And the thing that I learned is that there's no such thing as an air gap, because when users came up against something that they needed to do their job that you had locked out of their system, the first thing they would do is turn to the world's greatest penetration system, Google, and they would type, how do I do X? And if I was lucky, they would find out how to do X. If I was unlucky, they would find instructions that said, begin by typing sudo rm-r/*, right? So there is the only way to stop people from breaking their computers is not, I can't let you do that, Dave, but oh my goodness, that would be a bad idea. And oh my goodness, that would be a bad idea only works in circumstances of mutual trust and respect. This isn't wishy-washy, let's all hug each other, you should respect your users and they'll respect you. This is, if you want your users not to inadvertently root your systems, I mean, remember, the only reason Stuxnet worked is because someone stuck a thumb drive into a sensitive nuclear fuel refining station, right? Users all over have this problem. If they don't trust their administrators, they will do things behind their administrators' backs. Users are problem-solving machines. If we don't give them the tools to solve their problems, someone else will. It's like the talk to your kids about drugs. If you don't, who will, right? Talk to your users about root. If you don't, who will? So the only mechanism for ensuring that your users don't get up to mischief that harm you and them is a foundation of trust and a system that gives them warnings. And you know, if you read the proceedings of the CMU, Carnegie Mellon University annual workshop on human factors and security, there's a lot of stuff about this, not least the fact that, you know, a lot of that would be a bad idea warnings are almost always false positives. You know, almost every cert warning you have ever gotten from your browser was because of an expired cert. In fact, it's probably all of the cert warnings you've gotten from your browsers are an expired cert. We've effectively trained users to ignore cert warnings, so we have to get that part right. But the fact that that's hard doesn't mean the other bit that's not only hard but doesn't work and has all these bad circumstances is preferable. Maybe one or two more questions if we have any? I know that was all not very controversial and everybody agreed with me, so. Yep. Loudly and briefly, and I'll amplify it.
Thanks. Thanks. Sort of interested in practical activism, getting people, like people that are not yet informed about this. Maybe some tips for you.
Yeah. So, what are some practical things you can do to make this work? Well, I assume that many of you, even if you're not, you know, actively running the networks at ISPs, are probably the de facto admin for a large network of family and friends. And you know, you can start by doing things like all the major modern operating systems, including the made in South Africa one, Ubuntu, has a little tick box to do full disk encryption. You can show them how to use secure proxies. You can show them how to set up PGP. I mean, if there's one thing, PGP is hard. It's not transcendently hard. It's just a little hard. It's an extra hour at the end of a long day of trying to explain to someone who doesn't really get computers how computers work. But it is an hour extremely well spent, right? So teach them how to use good crypto on their mail, or just use signatures on their mail and understand what a man-in-the-middle attack is. All of these things are important ways that we can begin. South Africa's lawful interception laws, notice and takedown laws, and other cyber laws are, depending on your point of view, either more advanced or less advanced than those in the UK, the EU, and US and Canada, in that it seems like they've been less compromised by authoritarian figures and by large corporate interests. There isn't a lot of, from what I've gathered talking to solicitors here and people who are in network ops, there isn't a lot of that kind of specialist law that we're getting elsewhere. And as those fights come up, because they will come up, you can take to the streets, you can get your users mobilized, you can do things to kind of stop that stuff from coming to pass. You have ISOC here, the Free Software Foundation obviously has a great stake here, as do Ubuntu user groups and so on. It's one of the great hotbeds of free and open source software because of its contribution to the world in developing this very usable GNU Linux variant. You have that opportunity to do it, and moreover, you have a story you can tell that I think we're missing in the rest of the world. In the GDR, in the former East Germany, there is this enormous front-of-mind anxiety about surveillance and about authoritarianism because they have recent living memory experience. There are people alive who remember what happens when your nation of laws becomes a nation of men, when the technology is designed so that an individual can take such action as allows them to embark on a program of lawless authoritarianism without any real oversight or checks, when you can make a system that works very well to catch criminals but fails very badly in that it enables a single person to spy on a whole nation. And in the GDR, it's been a very effective tool at resisting surveillance technology and surveillance mandates and computer control overall. This is a story you get to tell here. This is a story that, when life gives you SARS, makes sarsaparilla. You have in living memory this horrific period of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. That's a thing that you can make recourse to when you're trying to explain to people why it matters that we are handing to not just this government's secret police, but the secret police of every government that follows, the power to spy on all of us as soon as we start using technology mandates to compromise networks and hardware. Last question, go ahead.
Sorry, picking up from that, we recently had the introduction of a biometric ID card here, which was described as goodbye to the old apartheid passbooks, your ID card is freedom.
Right.
A lot of people are more concerned about crime, fraud, and, a lot of people are more concerned about crime and fraud than they are necessarily about the kind of freedoms that come by not having to carry an ID card. I mean, that's the philosophy you're against. How do you tackle that?
So what about biometric ID cards, and what about people who want to trade freedom for security? I mean, there's, the Benjamin Franklin's aphorism, those who trade freedom for security deserve neither. But there are lots of questionable elements of biometric cards. And to my mind, as someone who's worked in security, the biggest problem with biometric cards is that your biometrics leak, right? The reason the police like biometrics for forensics is we leave them behind all the time, right? Your fingerprints are not a secret. Your fingerprints are all over this room, as are mine. There was a German chancellor who wanted to roll out biometric ID cards across the country, and the Chaos Computer Club, who are kind of fun-loving hacker trickster types, invited him to a debate and lifted his fingerprints off his water glass and printed them on acetate and inserted it into 10,000 copies of a national magazine. The problem with biometric identifiers is you can't revoke them, right? Your retina is not a secret. Your DNA sheds all over the place, right? It's kind of icky when you think about it. Your gait, unless you put gravel in your shoes every time you leave the house, your gait is not a secret. Your hand geometry, your fingerprints, all of these things are not secret, and as a result, they are bad authentication tokens because they're easy to clone and they're hard to revoke. It's like issuing you a password at birth and then never letting you change it. I mean, it's an incredibly bad idea from a security perspective, and I think that's a good technical basis to fight it on. I think in general, when it comes to privacy, that's just a microcosm of the wider problem of our inability to accurately price the present value of a privacy disclosure against the future consequences of it. And that's mostly because privacy is something that where the consequences and the cause are separated by an enormous amount of time and space. So I like to think of it by analogy to smoking, right? I was a smoker for a long time and I gave it up. And it was hard to give up, not least because no one puff from a cigarette gives you cancer. If you make enough puffs from a cigarette over enough time, you will get cancer. No one Facebook disclosure comes back and bites you in the ass. If you make enough Facebook disclosures over time, one of them will come back and surely bite you in the ass. Now, nobody would smoke if every puff generated a tumor. Nobody would be obese if every forkful of cheesecake immediately turned into an ounce of cellulite, right? The distance between action and consequence is the major problem with privacy. It's not that people don't care about privacy. It's that privacy is a very hard thing to get right, and it's hard to cost out. When I was in the 3rd grade, when I was 8 years old, I had a teacher who went into hospital with his wife to have their first baby, as many Canadians do. And as is common in Canadian maternity wards, a representative from a marketing firm came by after their baby was born with a basket full of free stuff, nappies, wipes, onesies, and so on. And they said, this is a simple trade. We give you the basket, you tell us your baby's name and your address, and we've got the date of birth, and we'll just stay in touch with you over the years. And like many Canadians, they made that trade. But unlike many Canadians, and something that happens all too commonly, when their baby was about 6 weeks old, it died suddenly. Sudden infant death syndrome. It just happens sometimes. And thereafter, every year, on their dead baby's birthday, they got a thank you package from these marketing firms, tracking the life of the baby that would have been. It's very hard to say they should have anticipated, as they sat there with their newborn in their arms, they should have anticipated the possibility that their baby would die before they accepted the basket of free nappies and onesies. So the story that when people say, well, all right, I'll trade this privacy for some benefit, means that we don't value our privacy, is, I think, a flawed story. And I had an argument recently with someone from a think tank in the UK called Demos. They do very good work, and the UK is reformulating its privacy policies, privacy statutes, and as part of that exercise, they wanted to determine what the public's attitudes were to privacy. And they said, we're going to do a survey of people and ask them how they feel about privacy. I said, if you survey the general public, you'll get the wrong answer. It's like surveying people who've never been mugged, how they feel about muggings. The right people to ask about privacy are the people who've had problems with their disclosures, not the people who haven't yet had problems with disclosures. If you want to know whether or not smoking is good for society, don't ask the smokers who haven't got cancer yet, right? So how do you get people to understand that when you build out the infrastructure of totalitarianism, when you build out a system that tracks everyone's movements all the time automatically through a system whose biometric identifiers can't be revoked and that are easy to clone, where other people could automatically make you appear to have been somewhere where you haven't been and so on, how do you explain it? You have to explain it in the same way we do with other public health issues. You have to try and render vivid in their imagination the possible consequences of that kind of tracking. And you have to tell them the stories that we hear when people come around and tell us about the harms that arise from smoking, that arise from other public health problems. And it's a hard problem. I think it's one that we're struggling with all over the world. I wrote a couple of novels about this, and I'm not shilling here. They're available as free Creative Commons downloads. But that's how I did my part, and we each have to do our own part. You know your friends and the people around you better than I do, and you have the insights that will allow you to try and explain those risks to them. But it is a difficult, difficult thing. Thank you all very much for having me.